Okay, so in this video, we're going to be asking the question, and the question is, does this phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, is this phrase introducing only the genealogy? So is this phrase only introducing verses 2 to 17? That's the question we're going to be asking. But before we ask that question, we're going to ask the question, what's up with this word here? What is up with this Greek word here, geneos, which is translated genealogy? And we're going to ask, well, does the word genealogy appear anywhere else in the New Testament? And it does. For instance, Paul will say in 1 Timothy, don't devote yourself to endless genealogies. Likewise, in Titus, he'll say, avoid foolish controversies and genealogies. And in the book of Hebrews, when the author is referring to Melchizedek, he's going to say he's without father or mother or genealogy, right? Now, what's interesting is that all these phrases are not the phrase that Matthew uses. So these are just, your standard word for genealogy. But Matthew decides to use a strange word. And this point is made by Joseph Fitzmyer in his Luke commentary. He writes, though this passage and its Mattine counterpart are commonly called genealogies of Jesus, neither Matthew nor Luke has used the Greek word genealogia in them. You can actually see two words there. Genea, I'm guessing just means generations, and logia, we all know that means word. So that's just the standard word for genealogies, right? But neither Matthew nor Luke uses this standard word. He goes on to say that word is found in the New Testament in Titus 3:9 and 1 Timothy 1:4. All right, so the question is, why doesn't Matthew just use the standard word found in other places in the New Testament for genealogy? All right, file that question away. We're going to bring that question up later. All right, we're going to bring it up later. Just store it away. We're now going to go back to our original question, which is, we know our original question. Is this statement only introducing the genealogy? All right, that's the question we're going to return to. And one very interesting reason to think that the phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, is only referring to the genealogy is because the phrase found in the first verse of Matthew is very similar to a statement found in Genesis 5:1, which introduces the genealogy of Adam. So we read, this is the book of the generations of Adam, and then what follows is a genealogy of Adam. And notice that this statement, the book of the generations of Adam, is very similar to the phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So what has been argued is that Matthew is purposefully alluding to Genesis 5:1 and the genealogy found there to draw your mind to the fact that Jesus is the new Adam. And I think this is a very good argument. So let's just kind of break things down a little bit more. So we know that the book of the genealogy is the word biblios geneos, which means biblios, book, genea, genealogy. And we know that in Genesis 5:1, this is in Hebrew, so obviously it's the word sepa toledot. Sepa means book, and toledot means generation. So Matthew is deliberately using similar language to Genesis 5:1 to indicate to his audience that, hey, I'm introducing Jesus' genealogy the same way that the author of Genesis introduced Adam's genealogy. And what makes this point even stronger is the point that this phrase, sepa toledot, is only found once in all of the Hebrew scriptures. So Wenham, in his commentary, makes this note. This is the book of the family history of Adam. A heading like this introduces each new section in Genesis. But only here is a book mentioned. Only here is a book mentioned. So what he's saying is, let's just get rid of the left-hand section here, is that the phrase like this, these are the generations of Noah. Here's Noah. This is a common phrase, and he just uses toledot. Same thing for Isaac. There's Isaac. These are the generations, toledot, of Isaac. Same thing for Jacob. These are the toledot of Jacob. This phrase toledot is a reoccurring phrase in Genesis. But only once, as Wenham said, only once is the phrase book of the generations used. All right. So the fact that only when the genealogy of Adam is introduced is a book mentioned strengthens the position that Matthew is telling us that by using book in his first verse, he's referring back to Adam's genealogy. Okay. interesting point. What makes this point even stronger is when we consider the Septuagint. We're going to be referring to the Septuagint a lot in this discussion because it's very important, because it's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it's quite clear that Matthew, for the most part, isn't using the Hebrew translation or the original Hebrew. He is using the Greek translation. That's very clear. So when the people who translated the Septuagint just means 70. That's why it's referred to as LXX. That's just the Roman numerals for 70. So when they sat down to translate it, and the translation happened like 100 years before Matthew put pen to paper, they sat down at Genesis 5:1 and they read it. This is the book of the generations, Sepa Teledot of Adam. And they said, how are we going to translate this into Greek? And what's interesting is that in place of Sepa Teledot, they put, wait for it, Biblios Geneos. Ooh, where does that phrase sound familiar? That's the phrase that Matthew uses, Biblios Geneos. All right, so this answers our question that we asked before. Remember I said to store it away? The question of why doesn't Matthew use the normal word for genealogy? All right, the reason is because he's mimicking Genesis 5:1. Right, so Matthew is telling us, hey, Jesus is the new Adam. And this is me introducing Jesus' genealogy the same way that the author of Genesis introduces Adam's genealogy. So that's basically the argument. So this proves, before we do that, this proves that Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 is only referring to the genealogy. And Arthur W. Pink makes this point very nicely in his book, Gleanings from Genesis. He writes, Genesis 5 begins a new section and traces for us the line of Seth. The opening words of this chapter are worthy of close attention. Nowhere else than 10 times we find in Genesis this phrase. These are the generations of. But here in Genesis 5:1, there is an important addition. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Nowhere else in Genesis, nor indeed the Old Testament, does this form of expression recur. But we do find it once more when we open the New Testament, and here it meets us in the very first verse, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. So there you go. I think that's a very strong argument that this phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, is only referring to the genealogy, because this is the way that Genesis 5 introduces Adam's genealogy. So I hope you enjoyed that. In our next video, we're going to be talking about, but does it not just introduce the genealogy, does it also introduce the origins of Jesus? So we'll be doing that in the next video. See you then.